As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Imagine this: one of the United States' closest allies, a NATO member and participant in many joint military operations, suddenly turns toward Washington's main strategic rival. It sounds like science fiction, but that's exactly what happened. Canada has rejected a multi-billion-dollar contract to purchase American aircraft and announced an agreement with China.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
This news came as a shock, not only to Washington, but to the entire Western world. After all, this is not just a deal to supply equipment, but something that until recently was considered impossible. North America is opening its doors to Chinese defense technology, and this decision has enormous consequences. Why is this so important? For decades, the US has maintained its leadership in the arms market by supplying its allies with advanced systems. These contracts were not only a business, but also an instrument of influence. When an ally buys equipment from Washington, it automatically becomes even more dependent on American military and political support. And suddenly, this mechanism has failed. Canada has effectively said, "We no longer want to be completely dependent on the US."
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
This raises many questions. What exactly made Chinese aircraft so much more attractive than American ones? Was it just the price? Or did Canada receive special conditions, such as access to technology and the opportunity to license production? Or is this a deeper political calculation, with Ottawa deciding to diversify its ties and use China as a counterweight to Washington's influence? It should not be forgotten that in recent years, relations between the US and Canada have not been the most peaceful. Disagreements on trade, energy, the environment, and even NATO military spending have created tension. However, all this seemed like minor cracks in a solid structure. Now we are seeing a real rift.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
The American media is already calling this a blow to national security, and that is no exaggeration. After all, if even its closest neighbor and partner is betting on China, does that mean other countries will also start thinking about changing their arms supplier? In recent years, China has been actively increasing its exports of military equipment, offering favorable terms and fairly modern weapons.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
What will be the consequences? For the US, this is not only the loss of a major contract, but also serious damage to its image. For China, it is a huge success, as it means entering a market that was previously closed to it. For Canada, it is a risky but potentially strategically advantageous move that shows the world that even traditional alliances can change in the 21st century. This is the story we will be discussing today. Why did Canada choose China? How will the US react, and what steps will it take in response? And most importantly, what does this mean for the future of world politics and for each of us? Stay with us, the most interesting part is yet to come. At the end of last year, Canada found itself at the center of a major deal that was supposed to strengthen its position in the defense sector while demonstrating its loyalty to its alliance commitments to Washington. The deal involved the purchase of American fighter jets, which for decades have been considered the gold standard in military aviation and a key element of NATO's overall strategy. The deal had been under discussion for more than 3 years, and many analysts considered it a done deal. Canada planned to invest more than $15 billion in the project, hoping to upgrade its aging fleet of aircraft and integrate it into North America's overall defense system. The American side insisted on tough conditions, including mandatory maintenance at US factories and complete dependence on American software. For Washington, this contract was not only of economic importance, but also symbolic. It was supposed to demonstrate once again that the US's closest allies in defense matters had no alternative.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Throughout the negotiations, there were repeated reports in the Canadian media that many military personnel were dissatisfied with the strictness of the American demands. Pilots pointed out that although the new aircraft were highly technological, their operation in northern conditions raised a lot of questions. Experts noted that adapting American fighter jets to the Canadian climate was too expensive, and that the delivery of spare parts and maintenance could take years. At the same time, the deal itself was presented as having no alternative. The US was the main partner, and no other options were even considered. But behind the scenes, the situation was much more complicated. A few months before the contract was terminated, experts began to actively discuss alternative proposals, and that was when China entered the game. No one officially confirmed the negotiations, but behind the scenes at the Canadian Department of National Defense, there was increasing talk that the country needed not only equipment, but also independence in its maintenance. Chinese aircraft were offered at a price almost 40% lower than the American ones. In addition, Beijing was ready to do something that the US had never agreed to: establish joint production of components in Canada, which would provide thousands of jobs and technological exchange. This point became a real sensation. After all, while it was more important for the US to keep Canada as a dependent customer, China, on the contrary, sought to show its willingness to partner on equal terms.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Canada's decision to abandon the American contract and terminate the agreement came as a shock to Washington. The White House had expected that after lengthy negotiations, the issue would be closed, and did not anticipate such a sharp turn. Many observers immediately called it a blow to US prestige, because for the first time a North American country had effectively rejected American military equipment in favor of Chinese equipment. For the Pentagon, this was not only an economic defeat, but also a symbolic one. After all, the question now arose: if even the closest neighbor, with whom the US is linked by NORAD and other collective defense agreements, can afford such a move, what is stopping other allies in Europe or Asia from following suit? It should be understood that the contract with the US had much deeper roots than simply purchasing aircraft. For the American military-industrial complex, such deals are a way to maintain market dominance. By purchasing American fighter jets, Canada effectively signed itself up for long-term dependence on American technology, spare parts, software, pilot training, modernization. All of this had to go through Washington. In the case of China, the situation was different. Beijing offered a package deal, not only aircraft, but also the possibility of localization, the participation of Canadian engineers in development, and access to certain technologies that the US was fundamentally unwilling to transfer. The situation was exacerbated by Canada's internal problems. The economic downturn, rising unemployment, and pressure from the opposition forced the government to seek profitable solutions. In this context, the American contract looked like another form of bondage. Money was going to the US, jobs were being created there, and Canadian industry was left out. The Chinese offer, on the contrary, looked like a lifeline. It is no coincidence that many experts noted that it was not the military but economists who played a decisive role in this choice. After all, the deal with China could bring tens of billions of dollars of investment into the country's economy and create thousands of jobs in the aviation industry.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
All this makes the story even more dramatic. Canada, long considered almost the little brother of the US in the military sphere, suddenly declares, "We want independence." This step was not just a rejection of aircraft, it was a challenge to the entire system of relations that had been built up over decades. Even NATO viewed this decision with concern. Behind the scenes in Brussels, there was talk that if Canada could afford to step out of the US's shadow, sooner or later other countries would decide to follow suit. A combination of factors, the high cost of American aircraft, strict maintenance conditions, the US's unwillingness to share technology, domestic economic pressures, and the attractiveness of Chinese offers, created that very turning point. As a result, the Canadian government did what had seemed impossible until recently. It rejected the American contract and turned to Beijing. And although Ottawa officially speaks only of pragmatism and profit, it is clear that the consequences of this decision will be far-reaching. The US has lost not only money but also confidence that its closest allies will always remain by its side. And Canada has unexpectedly found itself in the role of a country that, for the first time in many years, has openly challenged the usual rules of the game. When it became known that Canada was officially rejecting the American contract, the media literally exploded. According to journalists, there was irritation and bewilderment in Washington. Not long ago, all parties had expressed confidence in the completion of the deal, and now the document had been terminated unilaterally. The first comments from American politicians boiled down to this being an unwise move that weakens the overall security of North America. But behind the diplomatic rhetoric, there was a sense of real anger. The blow was particularly painful for the Pentagon, which had already allocated future revenues from servicing the contracts. The disruption of supplies meant not only the loss of billions of dollars, but also the destruction of the US's reputation as the only supplier of military equipment. Some experts in the American press compared what was happening to an open slap in the face to an ally, and some analytical publications warned that such a precedent could prompt other countries to seek alternatives.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
The reaction in Canada itself was mixed. Some welcomed the decision, pointing to its economic benefits and the fact that, for the first time in many years, the country had shown independence from the US. But there were also many critics who warned of the risks. Social media began discussing the question, can Canada afford to cooperate with China in such a sensitive area? And won't this lead to a deterioration in relations with Washington, on which not only the country's military but also its economic security depends? Meanwhile, details of the new agreement became known. China offered Canada a package that was difficult to ignore. Modern multi-role fighters equipped with the latest generation of electronic systems, with the possibility of further modernization to meet the specific needs of the Canadian Air Force. Unlike the American contract, where maintenance was to be completely controlled by Washington, the Chinese side agreed to transfer some of the technology and even to establish a joint research center on Canadian territory. This detail became particularly noteworthy. It was not just a matter of purchasing a finished product, but of starting a long-term partnership in a high-tech industry. At the same time, the payment terms turned out to be much more lenient. China offered to spread the payments over 20 years and to compensate for part of the amount with supplies of Canadian resources and joint investment projects. For an economy under pressure from inflation and rising energy prices, this was an extremely tempting offer. In addition, Beijing promised to include in the agreement a clause on the construction of an assembly plant that would provide up to 5,000 jobs in Canada. According to rumors, this point played a key role. The government viewed the deal not only as a military one, but also as a way to revive domestic industry. Of course, this caused a real storm in the US. Statements began to be heard in Congress that Canada was undermining the basis of Allied commitments. In some circles, there was even talk of revising the NORAD agreements. Although most experts acknowledged that this was unlikely to happen, the two countries are too closely linked on security issues. Nevertheless, the rhetoric became sharply harsher. American television channels showed reports that unanimously claimed that Canada had made a historic mistake by opening the door to Chinese influence in North America.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
The situation became even more tense when it became clear that the first deliveries of Chinese aircraft could begin in 2 years, while the American contract envisaged a protracted schedule until the end of the decade. This provided an additional argument in favor of the Chinese deal. Canada would be able to upgrade its fighter fleet more quickly and reduce its military aviation gap. For the US, the consequences were painful not only in financial terms. The trust of other allies was also threatened. In Europe, questions were increasingly being asked. If even Canada, which is literally next door to the US, can afford to turn to China, why shouldn't Europeans consider similar options? At a time when Washington is constantly pressuring its allies to increase defense spending, such sentiments are particularly dangerous. American analysts note that this contract was a strategic victory for China. It is not just about money or the number of aircraft. The main thing is the breakthrough into a market that was previously considered closed. North America has always been an area of absolute US influence, and now that monopoly has been broken. In essence, Canada's decision has shown that China is capable of competing even where the US would seem to have no rivals. The consequences for Canada itself are also ambiguous. On the one hand, the country receives economic bonuses and the opportunity for a technological leap forward. On the other hand, it risks finding itself at the center of diplomatic pressure from Washington. Scenarios are already being discussed in which the US will use trade instruments to show its dissatisfaction. Attempts to restrict Canadian access to American defense programs are also possible. Some experts warn that this could even affect joint NATO missions where trust plays a key role. Nevertheless, despite the threats and criticism, the Canadian government is not backing down. Official statements emphasize that the decision was made in the interests of national security and the economy. Ottawa says that the country is not renouncing its alliance commitments, but that it has the right to choose its own equipment suppliers. This argument sounds like a challenge, and it is precisely what makes the situation so resonant. So unexpectedly, the shift towards China became not just a trade agreement, but a political statement. Canada has demonstrated that the world is changing and that even the strongest alliances are showing cracks. For the first time, the US is faced with a situation where its closest partner is openly putting its own interests above the usual rules. This creates a new reality in which China has the chance to gain a foothold where its presence previously seemed unthinkable. Today, it is difficult to deny that Canada's decision to abandon American aircraft and turn to China is an event whose consequences go far beyond a mere trade deal. In world politics, such steps become symbols and markers of turning points. When a first-tier ally chooses a path that directly contradicts Washington's interests, it changes the entire architecture of international relations. And here it is important to understand that we are talking not only about what aircraft will be stationed at Canadian air bases, but also about what the balance of power will look like in the 21st century. For the US, this is a blow to its alliance system. Since World War II, Washington has been building a network of military and economic ties, with the key element being the Allies' dependence on American technology and supplies. The NATO, NORAD, dozens of bilateral agreements, all this created the illusion of a monolithic bloc. But Canada's decision has shown that even within North America itself, cracks can be found. And if such cracks become visible, it means that the US risks losing control not only over the arms market, but also over the very concept of allied discipline. Immediately after the announcement of the deal with China, European analysts began to talk about how Washington could find itself in a position where it would have to spend more and more resources on retaining its allies. In Brussels, there were fears that Canada's move would be seen as an example. If even the closest partner of the US can afford to engage in open cooperation with Beijing, why should European countries endlessly tolerate pressure and inflated prices for American weapons? And although no one in the EU is yet talking about repeating the Canadian scenario, the mood is becoming anxious. After all, the very idea of the no alternative nature of American weapons has been called into question. China, on the contrary, is demonstrating that its soft power strategy is reaching a new level. Whereas Beijing previously focused on Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, it has now broken into what was considered the untouchable zone of US influence. Moreover, the Chinese media openly calls the deal with Canada a symbol of a new era of equal relations. Beijing is showing that it is ready to play on a global level and is doing so in the most profitable way possible, not through military confrontation, but through offers of cooperation and economic benefits. This poses a serious challenge for NATO. Formally, Canada remains in the alliance, and its obligations have not disappeared. But if a country within the bloc chooses China in a key area of armaments, it undermines trust between allies. Imagine a situation in which, in the future, during NATO exercises or in the event of a real operation, one of the countries has Chinese-made systems at its disposal. This creates a threat of data leaks, equipment incompatibility, and, most importantly, political division. And although officials in Brussels are trying to smooth things over, military experts unofficially acknowledge that such a move by Canada could be the beginning of a long process of eroding the alliance.